The man who baptized Jesus spent his last months in a prison cell asking whether Jesus was the wrong man. It is in Matthew chapter 11, verse 3, and the words are these: "Are you the one who is to come, or shall we look for another?" John the Baptist sent that question. The man who had stood in the Jordan with his hands on him, who had seen the heavens open, who had pointed at him in front of a crowd and told them exactly who he was. 2 men carried it. They came down the road toward the Galilean lake in the worst heat of the afternoon, and the dust on their clothes was not Galilean dust. It was the pale grit of the eastern hills, the kind that gets into the seams of a garment and stays there. And anyone watching them come would have known before they spoke that they had crossed the Jordan and walked for days. They found the man they wanted in a crowd near the water, among the sick and the curious and the ones who had come only to see. They had carried that question about 120 kilometers, from a mountain fortress on the Nabatean frontier, from a prisoner who was asking whether he had been wrong about all of it. He would die in that fortress. The record does not tell us how long he waited there, and it does not tell us whether he ever learned what Jesus said about him to the crowd, out loud, the moment those 2 messengers turned around and started walking home. This is the story of the years between the river and the fortress, the years John spent apart from the man he had spent his whole life announcing. Start with the man himself, because he is stranger than the pictures of him suggest. He was born into the priesthood, and he walked away from it. Luke opens his gospel by telling us that John's father Zechariah served in the division of Abijah, and that his mother Elizabeth was also descended from Aaron, a family line with a career attached to it. A priest's son in the 1st century inherited a place in the temple rotation the way a stonecutter's son inherited a chisel, and John was born eligible for all of it. He never took it. Luke closes his account of the boyhood with a single sentence, chapter 1, verse 80. "The child grew and became strong in spirit, and he was in the wilderness until the day of his public appearance to Israel." That is the entire biography of 30 years. A man with a hereditary claim on the most prestigious religious institution in his nation went out into the Judean desert instead and stayed there. And when he finally came back into public view, he did not come as a priest. He came dressed as something older. Mark describes the clothing in his 1st chapter, verse 6. A garment of camel's hair, a leather belt around his waist, and a diet of locusts and wild honey. That description is not incidental. Open the 2nd book of Kings, chapter 1, verse 8, and you find Elijah described in almost exactly those terms: a hairy man with a leather belt around his waist. 1st century readers knew that text the way we know a national anthem. The clothing was a claim. It said something about who this man believed he was standing in for. And we will come back to that, because John himself would later refuse the identification when someone asked him directly. And we are not depending on the Gospels for any of this. Flavius Josephus, a Jewish aristocrat writing for Romans decades later, with no interest whatever in advancing Christian claims, describes him in Book 18 of the Antiquities as a good man who urged the Jews toward justice toward one another and piety toward God. He mentions Jesus nowhere in the passage. Whatever else is uncertain, John existed, and he had a following large enough that a Roman-era historian had to explain him to Gentiles. What he did with that following is the reason the story turns. He set up at the Jordan, and he preached repentance, and the crowds came out of the cities to a riverbank to be washed by a man in animal hair. Then, one day, Jesus came down into the water with everyone else, and John baptized him, and by every account something happened at that moment that neither of them treated as ordinary. That event is where most tellings of John's life reach their peak and stop. But John lived on after it, and for a while, this is the part almost nobody covers, the two men were working at the same time, in the same region, doing the same thing. The Gospel of John records it plainly in chapter 3, verses 22 through 24. Jesus and his disciples went into the Judean countryside and were baptizing there. John was also baptizing at a place called Enon near Salim, because there was plenty of water there. And then the Gospel writer adds a note that tells us exactly where we are in the calendar. John had not yet been put in prison. Two ministries running in parallel, both drawing crowds, both offering water. It did not stay balanced, and the first person to say so out loud was not a critic. It was one of John's own. The same chapter, verses 25 through 29, gives us the scene. A dispute broke out over purification, and John's disciples came to him with something between a report and a complaint. "The man who was with you across the Jordan," they said, "the one you testified about, he is baptizing and everyone is going to him. Everyone." Read it slowly, because that sentence is the beginning of the separation this whole video is about, and it does not arrive as a Roman soldier at the door. It arrives as a grievance from the people closest to him. His students were watching the crowd drain away toward someone else, and they came to their teacher to tell him it was happening, and it is very hard to read that exchange without hearing them ask him to do something about it. He did not. He answered with a wedding image. "The one who has the bride is the bridegroom," he told them, "and the friend of the bridegroom stands and listens for the bridegroom's voice and rejoices when he hears it." And that joy, John said, is now complete. Then verse 30, 6 words that have outlived every other thing he said. "He must increase, but I must decrease." That line is usually read as resignation, and it is nothing of the kind. It is a program stated out loud while he still had a crowd, while he was still free, while he still had the option of competing. He is not being edged out. He is stepping back on purpose and telling the people who work for him to be glad about it. The pressure was not only internal. Chapter 4 opens with the news reaching the religious establishment. The Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John. The comparison John's own students had made privately in a dispute about water was now being tallied by the authorities in Jerusalem. 2 teachers, 2 crowds, and someone in the capital was keeping score. And then, somewhere in that period, John did the thing that ended his freedom. He publicly denounced the marriage of Herod Antipas. Antipas was the tetrarch of Galilee and Perea. A tetrarch, not a king, though Mark uses the popular title in chapter 6, and the correction is worth making because it explains everything about the man's insecurity. He was a son of Herod the Great, who had inherited a fraction of his father's territory and none of his father's crown, and he ruled at Roman sufferance. He had set aside his first wife, a Nabatean princess, the daughter of King Archaeology IV, in order to marry Herodias, and Herodias had previously been married to Antipas's own half-brother. Which brother is a genuine problem in the sources, and it is worth settling here rather than later. Mark, chapter 6, verse 17, calls the first husband Philip. Josephus calls him Herod, a different son of Herod the Great, and a distinct man from Philip the Tetrarch. That is a real conflict between our 2 best sources. It might be a double name, an error in Mark, or an error in transmission. Nobody knows, and anyone who tells you the matter is settled is overselling. That was the objection. It was not a matter of taste. Leviticus, chapter 18, verse 16, and again in chapter 20, verse 21, prohibits a man from taking his brother's wife. John said so publicly, to the ruler's face, in the ruler's own territory. Luke, in chapter 3, verses 19 and 20, tells us that John reproved Antipas concerning Herodias and concerning all the evil things Antipas had done. Note that Luke widens the charge beyond the marriage, and that Antipas added to it all by shutting John up in prison. Luke says it in one clause. It was not one clause to live through. Somewhere on the Jordan, on an ordinary working day, with people still standing in the water waiting their turn, soldiers came down the bank for him. They took him east, away from the river, up through the Perean hills, a climb of days, to a ridge above the Dead Sea, with ravines falling away on 3 sides and one narrow approach along a saddle. The gate closed behind him. As far as any record shows, he never came back down. Before we follow him up there, I want to ask you something. John saw the thing he had built start moving toward someone else, and he called it joy. Have you ever had to hand something over? A role, a work, a place you had made, a group of people who used to come to you and watched it thrive in somebody else's hands? What did that actually feel like on the inside, on the day it happened, not in the version you tell afterward? I am not asking whether you did the right thing. I am asking what it cost. Tell me below. I rid them. So where was he exactly, and what was it like in there? Josephus names it, and the Gospels never do. In the same passage of the Antiquities, Book 18, he tells us that John was sent in chains to Machaerus and put to death there. That is our only source for the location. And it is worth saying plainly that on this particular fact, the Gospel writers are silent. And there is a reason he ended up in a tetrarch's fortress rather than a Roman prison. Judea belonged to a Roman prefect. Galilee and Perea belonged to Antipas. John had been baptizing on the eastern bank of the Jordan, in Perean territory, in Antipas's jurisdiction. The place where he stood in the water decided which ruler had the power to take him. Machaerus is a real place. You can go there. It stands in modern Jordan, near the village of Machaerus, and it is not a building on a hill so much as a hill that was turned into a building. The citadel sits about 1,100 meters above the surface of the Dead Sea, which lies below it to the west. The Hasmonean king Alexander Jannaeus fortified it first. The Roman general Gabinius tore it down. Herod the Great rebuilt it on a far grander scale and put a palace inside the walls, which is what Josephus describes in the 7th book of the Jewish War. Franciscan archaeologists dug it out in the late 1970s, and a Hungarian mission has been working there since 2009, and what they have brought up is a royal courtyard, a colonnade, a heated bath, and cisterns cut down into the living rock. Those cisterns are not a detail. On a waterless ridge in Perea, they are the only reason that place could hold a garrison, a court, and a prisoner at all. What was his confinement actually like? Here the Gospels give us something Josephus does not. Mark, chapter 6, verse 20, tells us that Antipas feared John, knowing him to be a righteous and holy man, and kept him safe, and that when he heard him, he was greatly perplexed. And yet he heard him gladly. Read that with the practical implications in view. The tetrarch was having the prisoner brought up, listening, going away disturbed, and then coming back to do it again. In this period, custody was normally a holding measure pending a decision, rather than a sentence in itself, and that fits what we are seeing. John was not sealed in and forgotten. He was held and consulted. Not one sentence of those conversations survives. We know they happened. We know they unsettled the man who had the power to end them, and we have no idea what was said. That silence is one of the most frustrating in the New Testament. We also know his own disciples had access to him. And that raises the question the title of this video asks: what was John actually doing in there? The answer the texts give is that he was still teaching. His disciples were not a crowd, they were a school with a rule. Luke tells us in chapter 5, verse 33, that John's disciples fasted often and offered prayers as a recognized discipline distinct from what Jesus' followers did. And in chapter 11, verse 1, one of Jesus' own disciples asks him to teach them to pray, because John taught his disciples. Sit with that. John had a taught prayer, a fasting discipline, and a body of students formed enough that outsiders could point at their practices and ask for an equivalent. Whatever was happening at Machaerus, he was still running that school through the men who carried his messages. And while he was in there, running a school through messengers, Jesus said something about him that almost never gets read aloud. Jesus, teaching in Jerusalem while John was still alive, said this about him, as recorded in the 5th chapter of John's Gospel, verses 33 through 35. He was a burning and shining lamp, and you were willing to rejoice for a while in his light. For a while. The crowds that had walked out of the cities into the desert to be baptized had already cooled. The excitement had run its course and moved on while the man who caused it was still breathing, in a cell 120 kilometers away. He had not only lost his freedom, he had been, in the ordinary way of these things, forgotten. And that is the setting for the question we started with. Matthew chapter 11, verses 2 and 3. John, hearing in prison about the deeds of the Christ, sent word by his disciples and asked whether he was the one who was to come, or whether they should look for another. Every honest reader has to stop there. This is the man who said he wasn't worthy to untie the sandal, the man who saw the Spirit descend. Now, after months or years in a fortress, with the movement he launched moving on without him, asking for confirmation. We do not know how long he had been in there when he sent it. No source gives a duration. The plural in the phrase final years is an inference from the gap between the parallel ministry period and the execution, months at absolute minimum, plausibly 1 to 3 years. And I am not going to give you a number that no text supports. Look at what Jesus did with the question, because this is the center of the whole story. He did not rebuke it. He did not send back a reprimand about weak faith, and he did not withdraw the commission. He sent back evidence. Matthew chapter 11, verses 4 through 6. Go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and good news is preached to the poor. Every clause of that answer is lifted from Isaiah, from chapters 35 and 61. Jesus answered a prophet in the prophet's own language, handing him a checklist from the scroll he had spent his life quoting, and let him do the arithmetic himself. And then the messengers left. And the moment they were out of earshot, Jesus turned to the crowd and talked about John. Matthew, verses 7 through 11. What did you go out into the wilderness to see? A reed shaken by the wind? A man in soft clothing? A prophet? Yes, and more than a prophet. And then the sentence. Among those born of women, there has not arisen anyone greater than John the Baptist. He said it behind his back. He said it to a crowd in Galilee, after the men carrying the reply had already started walking. Whether it was ever repeated to a prisoner in a fortress across the Jordan, no text in the New Testament says. It is entirely possible, and there is no way to close this question, that the greatest man born of women died without ever hearing that anyone had said so. The end, when it came at a party. Mark tells it in chapter 6, verses 21 through 29. Antipas gave a banquet on his birthday for his nobles, his military commanders, and the leading men of Galilee. That guest list is the key to the room. This was the officer corps and the provincial aristocracy, brought out to a border fortress, reclining on couches around low tables in the formal dining arrangement standard in Herodian palaces. And Machaerus has excavated dining rooms of exactly that kind. The daughter of Herodias danced, and the tetrarch was pleased, and he made her an oath in front of all of them. "Ask me for anything, up to half my kingdom." Two things about that promise. First, Antipas had no kingdom. He was a tetrarch and could not have given away half of something he did not possess. Second, the phrase is not original. It is the formula spoken by King Ahasuerus in the book of Esther in chapter 5 and again in chapter 7. And once you see that you cannot unsee it, a foreign-styled court, a drunken royal oath, a woman working through a young woman to destroy an enemy she cannot legally touch. A note on the girl, because popular retellings have done real damage here. Mark and Matthew never name her, and never describe the dance as anything but a dance. The name Salome comes from Josephus, who also tells us she later married Philip the Tetrarch. The erotic reading that has dominated Western painting and film for centuries is not in the Greek text of either gospel. It is a later overlay. She asked for the head of John the Baptist on a platter. Mark says the Tetrarch was deeply grieved, and that because of his oaths and his guests, he did not want to break his word to her. That is the mechanism, and it is more sordid than lust. A man who had been going down to a cell to listen to a prisoner killed him, rather than lose face in front of his own officers. He sent an executioner. It was done in the fortress. And here the two accounts we have been holding side by side finally split apart, and it is worth naming the split rather than papering over it. Mark gives us the banquet, the oath, the girl, the platter, and no politics. Josephus gives us the politics. Antipas feared John's influence over the crowds and struck first to prevent a rising, and says nothing at all about a banquet, a dance, an oath, or a beheading. The manner of death comes from Mark alone. The location comes from Josephus alone. They are not the same story told twice. They are two partial accounts, and they are compatible without being identical, because a public denunciation of a ruler's marriage in a client territory is itself a political act. Both can be true. Neither is complete. Matthew chapter 14, verse 12, tells us what happened next, and it is 4 words long in effect. His disciples came, took the body, and buried it. Where? No one says. A tomb at Sebaste in Samaria was being venerated by the 4th century, and later sites across Europe have claimed relics, but none of that is confirmed. It is tradition, not evidence. Then they went and told Jesus, and Matthew, verse 13, when Jesus heard it, he withdrew from there in a boat to a desolate place by himself. That is the only recorded reaction of Jesus to the death of John, and it is a private one. He went to be alone. The crowds followed him around the shore on foot and found him, and the feeding of the 5,000 happens in the immediate aftermath of a grief that was never allowed to finish. 2 men walked away from that fortress with very different endings ahead of them. Start with Antipas. In the year 36, Aretas, the father of the wife he had discarded, destroyed his army, and Josephus reports that many Jews read the defeat as judgment for the killing of John. That is Josephus reporting what people said, not my claim about how God works. 3 years after that, he was accused before the emperor, stripped of his territory, and banished. Herodias was offered an exemption and refused it, and went with him. The man who killed a prophet rather than lose face in front of a room full of officers lost the office, the territory, and the room. Now, look at what John got, because the accounting is not what you would expect from a man who died in a cell. His name did not fade. In Mark chapter 11, verses 27 through 33, during the last week of Jesus' life, the chief priests and scribes and elders confront him in the temple and demand to know by what authority he acts. Jesus answers with a question. The baptism of John, was it from heaven or from man? And the entire leadership of the temple goes silent, because if they say from heaven, they have to explain why they did not believe him. And if they say from man, they are afraid of the crowd, since everyone held that John really was a prophet. A dead man's reputation, years after his execution, shut down the most powerful religious body in Jerusalem in the middle of its own courtyard. His movement did not die either. Turn to Acts, chapter 18, verse 25, and chapter 19, verses 1 through 7, and you find people in Ephesus, hundreds of kilometers away, more than 20 years later, who had received the baptism of John and knew nothing beyond it. The school he was still running from a prison cell outlived him by decades and crossed the Aegean. And there is one thing said about John, over and over by everyone except John. The Hebrew Bible ends in Malachi chapter 4 with the promise of Elijah before the day of the Lord. Before John is born, the announcement to Zechariah says the child will go before the Lord in the spirit and power of Elijah. Luke chapter 1 verse 17, quoting Malachi almost word for word over an unborn baby. Jesus then says it outright in Matthew 11 verse 14, if you are willing to accept it, this is Elijah who was to come. And John denies it. In the first chapter of the Gospel of John, verse 21, a delegation asks him point blank whether he is Elijah, and he answers, I am not. An angel says it before his birth, and the Messiah says it after his death, and the only man anyone actually asked said no. The usual resolution is that he filled the role without being the person, and that reading is reasonable. The texts still are not saying the same thing, and the tension is more interesting than the smoothing. Look at the shape of it, though. A prophet in animal hair, out of the wilderness, confronting a compromised ruler whose wife wants him dead. That is John and Antipas and Herodias. And it is also, precisely, Elijah and Ahab and Jezebel in the first book of Kings. The evangelists knew that story cold. But the pattern breaks at the end. Elijah escapes into the wilderness and is taken up alive. John does not escape. The man in the fortress does not get the chariot, which leaves the last thing, and it is the one I most want you to hold on to. Sometime after John's death, according to the Gospel of John, chapter 10, verses 40 through 42, Jesus went back across the Jordan. Not to a new place, to the place where John had been baptizing at the first. The original ground, the riverbank where the crowds had come out and where the whole thing began. And he stayed there. And people came to him, and what they said to each other in that spot was this: John never performed a single sign. But everything John said about this man was true, and many believed there. See what that is? It is the answer to the question John sent from the fortress, delivered on the ground he had stood on, by ordinary people who had no reason to say it except that it had turned out to be so. He never heard it. He was already dead. The man who spent his last months asking whether he had given his life to the right thing was vindicated by strangers, standing in his own water in front of the person he had asked about. So here is what this has to do with you, sitting where you are right now. You may know exactly what that fortress feels like. Not the stones, the position. The room is smaller than the one you imagined you would end up in. The work you gave yourself to has moved on. and is doing well without you. And it turns out it did not need you the way you thought. And there is a question you have not said out loud, because saying it feels like betrayal. What if I was wrong about the whole thing? Notice what did not happen when John asked it. Jesus did not correct him, and did not downgrade him, and did not suggest that the doubt called for revising the assessment. He sent back the evidence, and then told a crowd that no one born of women was greater. He asked the question from inside a life that had already been spent, and the asking did not undo the spending. That is the part I would ask you to carry out of this. Doubt asked from inside, faithfulness is not the same thing as abandonment, and it never has been. If this reconstruction was worth your time, subscribe. We spend every video rebuilding a single stretch of the 1st century, from the texts, the excavations, and the historians who were actually there, and there is a great deal of the world John lived in still to walk through. And if someone came into your mind while you were listening, someone in the smaller room, wondering whether they got it right, send this to them today rather than meaning to. Then tell me one thing in the comments before you go. Have you ever asked honestly whether the thing you gave your life to was the right thing? Not as a crisis of faith, as a question from inside it, by someone who had already gone all in. John asked. He asked from a cell, through messengers, across 120 kilometers, and the answer came back in the language of Isaiah. What he never got, as far as any text records, was the other half of what was said that day. The part spoken to the crowd once the messengers were gone. There has not arisen anyone greater. He died without hearing it. And it was true anyway.